Somewhere along the Mississippi River, in a parish whose name has been deliberately erased from official records, there once stood a plantation that older people in Louisiana will not speak of, not even now. The place had no proper name by the time the 20th century arrived. It was simply called that place, or the old place down by the river, and sometimes, in whispers, the indigo plantation. What little remains in scattered letters and private journals claims that 17 men died there under circumstances so disturbing that Louisiana authorities ordered every official document burned in 1847. The order went out quietly, with no debate and no public explanation. Clerks obeyed. Files vanished. Case numbers disappeared. What could be erased was erased. And yet, pieces survived in the margins of history, like flecks of ash that refused to blow away. What made the case unforgettable to those few who saw the original reports was not the number of bodies. Men died constantly in the antebellum South. Accidents, fevers, duels, riverboat explosions, slave rebellions, drunken brawls, death was as common as humidity. No, what made this case terrifying was a single repeated detail that appeared again and again in every witness account, every physician's note, every hurried line scrawled in the margins by men who did not want to believe what they were writing. Each man had been found clutching a small piece of indigo-dyed cloth in his hand, his fingers locked around it with the rigidity of the dead. Each man's eyes were wide open, staring at nothing, as if frozen in the instant of seeing something unspeakable. And on their lips, according to servants and relatives who bent close to hear the last breath, was the same whispered name. The woman they spoke of was described in plantation ledgers and private correspondence as the most sought-after property in the entire Delta region. She was never listed by a stable surname in bills of sale. She appeared instead as that Gautier woman, the Charleston girl, the acquisition, the copper-skinned beauty, the indigo woman, the one from Sandan. In ledgers she was itemized as an asset, but no complete bill of sale bearing her full name has ever been recovered. Her trail runs like a thread through the 1820s and 1830s, Virginia, Georgia, South Carolina, Louisiana, always tied to ruin, scandal, or sudden death. For more than a century and a half, her story was deliberately excised from Louisiana's written record, kept alive only in fragments. A widow's diary where whole pages were torn out, coded letters passed between plantation owners, and testimonies that were sealed by court order in 1840 and not unsealed until 1952, only to vanish again into misplaced archives. If you try to find her in official histories, you won't. The record prefers ghosts that can be dismissed as superstition, not the kind of living woman whose patience outlasts laws, wars, and generations. What happened on that unnamed plantation reveals something more terrifying than any tale of rattling chains or moaning spirits. It reveals the calculated patience of a woman who understood with unsettling clarity how desire could become a weapon, how men's obsessions could be turned into a noose they would tighten with their own hands. It reveals how a person stripped of every legal right can still become the patient architect of her enemy's destruction. To understand how it began, you have to go back to 1839, to the Mississippi Delta at the height of its power. It was a landscape of contradictions. Wealth built on mud, elegance rising out of rot. Magnificent columned mansions rose from swampland, their white paint gleaming in the brutal southern sun. Cypress trees, draped in Spanish moss like hanging shrouds, leaned over slow black water. The air itself felt heavy with money, thick with the smell of sugarcane, cotton, and wet earth, of sweat and molasses, tobacco and river silt. Temperatures climbed, tempers flared, and fortunes were made and lost with the weather. By then the Delta was the richest agricultural region in America, measured not only in acres and bales but also in human bodies. The wealth that made the chandelier sparkle and the silverware shine came from men and women bent double in the fields, from children picking cotton until their fingers bled, from lives calculated in profit margins. Dawn to darkness, day after day, their labor-filled ledgers. Their names did not. Each plantation operated as a tiny kingdom, with near absolute power vested in its owner. In St. Landry Parish, though that wasn't what people called it then, 47 major plantations sprawled along the river and inland bayous. Each was its own empire. Each had its own laws. The men who ruled those estates, most of them French Creole families whose roots in the region went back before the Louisiana Purchase, competed in everything. They measured themselves not only by harvest yields and the number of enslaved people they owned, but by the width of their verandas, the luster of their imported china, the pedigree of their horses, and, most grotesquely, by the quality and appearance of their human property. A man might brag not only about his acres but about the lightness of a domestic servant's skin or the refinement of a housegirl's manners, as if he were discussing wine or livestock. In this world of rigid hierarchy and elaborate social ritual, there existed an underground market that polite society did not speak of in daylight, but which many men eagerly participated in after dark. Certain enslaved women, those considered exceptionally beautiful by the standards of the time, were treated like rare luxury goods. They became objects of intense and private competition among the wealthiest planters. They were not merely workers or even house servants, they were trophies, status symbols, secret currencies in a marketplace that left almost no paper trail. These women were traded quietly between trusted associates, gifted as part of opaque business arrangements, kept in separate cottages, and sometimes fought over in ways plantation ledgers very carefully avoided recording. Letters from that era carry strange phrases. The parcel from Savannah, our mutual interest from Charleston, the matter of the copper girl, of which we spoke in confidence. A few of these letters survive. None speak plainly. All point toward a practice so normalized among planters and so shameful to acknowledge that it had developed its own code. Into this shadowy trade, in the spring of 1839, came a woman whose surviving descriptions sound less like an ordinary person and more like someone designed to torment the men who would encounter her. She arrived in St. Landry Parish in the custody of a cotton broker named Lisandre Thibault, a man known for his ability to acquire unusual property for planters whose appetites exceeded what local auctions could provide. Thibault dealt in rarity, the fastest stallions, the rarest china, the most exotic servants. When his name appeared in a letter, it usually meant something scandalous was about to change hands. In his private journal, discovered in an attic in Baton Rouge in 1923, he refers to her only as the Gordier acquisition, a term cold enough to chill anyone who reads it. He notes that she had been purchased from a declining estate in Charleston, South Carolina, for the staggering sum of $3,000, more than 3 times the price of a skilled male field hand. That number alone made other men's eyes widen. They wanted to know what could justify such a price. Thibault did his best to answer in his own way. He described her as possessing extraordinary classical features, cheekbones an artist would envy, a mouth that seemed perpetually on the edge of either kindness or cruelty, depending on the light. Her skin, he wrote, was the color of burnished copper, warm and luminous. She was unusually tall for a woman of the time, with a bearing that made her seem taller still. Her eyes, he noted uneasily, were of a peculiar light brown, almost golden, so penetrant in their intelligence that even hardened overseers seemed discomposed in her presence. But what unsettled Thibault the most was not her beauty. It was her stillness. She possesses a composure that appears almost unnatural, he wrote, as though she is always watching the room, always listening beneath the words spoken aloud. I confess she unsettles me, though I cannot say precisely why. Coming from a man who dealt daily in the buying and selling of human beings, that sentence is perhaps the most revealing thing he ever wrote. She was, his notes say, 26 years old. That, too, was unusual. Women caught up in this particular shadow trade were typically much younger, teenagers, or women barely into their 20s. At 26, most enslaved women had already borne children, had bodies marked by hard labor and hardship. Her age suggested a more complex history. Years of observation, losses survived, patterns studied. It hinted at depths most of the men around her were incapable of recognizing, or chose not to see. Thibault planned to sell her at a private auction to the highest bidder among 5 of the parish's richest men. He invited them by letter, each man receiving a sealed note written in careful, formal French, an invitation to a discreet gathering to consider the acquisition of an item of exceptional rarity and value. He knew their appetites. He knew their pride. He knew that what they really wanted was not just a beautiful woman, but to outbid each other for her. But before that auction could take place, something happened that no one in St. Landry Parish could explain, and that those who lived through it would never quite recover from. The woman escaped, or appeared to. On the night before the scheduled auction, Thibault had her locked in a boarding house room in Opelousas, the parish seat. He prided himself on being careful. The door was locked from the outside. The window was barred. A guard sat in a chair in the hallway all night, the weight of his boredom pressing him down, his eyes drooping, his hand resting on his gun. Nothing unusual was heard. No sounds of struggle. No broken glass. No whispered voices. Yet when Thibault unlocked the door the next morning, the room was empty. The bed was neatly made. The washstand was undisturbed. The barred window was intact. No rope, no torn sheet, no scratched paint on the frame. She was simply gone. The only trace of her was a small piece of indigo cloth torn from the hem of her dress, lying on the floor by the bed, and a faint sweet smell that lingered in the air, thick and cloying. Witnesses would later describe it as resembling oleander flowers, sweet, ornamental, and faintly poisonous. Panic rippled through the town. A woman worth $3,000 was not something a man like Thebault could afford to lose. Slave patrols were assembled overnight. Men on horseback fanned out along the river road and into the swamps. Overseers took dogs into the cypress brakes, shouting her description. Rewards were posted on hastily printed broadsides. Every free person of color in Opelousas found themselves questioned, harassed, sometimes beaten for information they did not have. The parish erupted into frantic motion. And then, 3 days later, the woman walked calmly back into the story. It was mid-afternoon when a group of field hands at the Duval plantation looked up from their work and saw a figure walking alone up the Oakline Drive as if she belonged there. The live oaks formed a green tunnel from the road to the house, their branches meeting overhead, their shadows dappling the dusty path. Down that tunnel she came, bareheaded, wearing a dress of plain dark fabric, walking with that same quiet, measured step that Thebault had noted. She did not run. She did not plead. She simply walked until she reached the steps of the big house, then stopped and waited. Sebastien Duval, one of the wealthiest planters in Louisiana, came out to see what the commotion was about. He was 43, dark-haired, with the kind of sharp, calculating face people trusted in business and distrusted in everything else. His estate sprawled over 3,000 acres of prime sugarcane land. He owned more than 200 enslaved people, scores of mules and horses, and owed more money than anyone realized. He was recently widowed. His grief, such as it was, had already been absorbed into the rhythms of work and profit. He was also one of the 5 men invited to Thebault's private auction. The woman raised her eyes to his, and whatever happened in that silent moment changed the course of both their lives. When asked later how she had come there, why she had chosen that plantation among all the others, she answered with 3 quiet words spoken in a voice that witnesses described as low, steady, and oddly melodic. "I chose you." Those words landed in a world where enslaved people were assumed to have no choices at all. They were bought, sold, ordered, punished, moved like furniture. For one of them to say, "I chose you" to a white man of Duval's rank was not just unusual. It was unthinkable. The sentence should have chilled him. It should have made him wary. It should have made him send for the sheriff. Instead, it flattered him. Within hours, Duval had sent word to Thebault. A bargain was struck in haste. Duval paid double the original asking price, $6,000 in cash, a small fortune in one transaction. He took legal possession of the woman that day. In his household ledgers he wrote her name for the first time, in his own angular hand. Celeste. Whether that was the name she gave him or the name he imposed on her, no one can say with certainty. It is the name that stuck. Within a week, Celeste had been installed not in the slave quarters, but in a small cottage on the property, a neat, whitewashed building that had once housed his late wife's lady's maid. She was given fine clothes, better food than most of the household staff, her own servant, and a degree of quiet privilege that would have been unthinkable under typical plantation codes. Servants saw her walking the gardens with Duval in the evenings, their heads bent together, sometimes talking in low voices, sometimes walking in silence. They saw her reading on the porch of her cottage by lamplight. They saw Duval stand at the window of his study watching the path that led down to her door. The scandal spread faster than any official notice. White women whispered behind their fans at church, eyes darting toward the Duval pew. Other planters, men who had been prepared to bid for her themselves, watched with a mixture of envy, disgust, and curiosity they tried to disguise. Duval's own relatives sent him letters laced with moral concern and financial anxiety. His married sister in New Orleans wrote, "You risk not only your reputation but the stability of the estate with this arrangement. People are speaking of it everywhere." He did not reply. What no one in St. Landry Parish knew, and what would not be fully understood until long after everyone involved was dead, was that Celeste had not met Sebastien Duval by accident. She had known his name before she ever set foot in Louisiana. She had studied him from a distance for years, following his dealings through other men's letters, listening whenever his name was spoken in slave quarters and in the back rooms of counting houses. She knew his habits, his pride, his debts, the thin line between his apparent prosperity and the financial disaster stalking his cane fields. She knew about his quiet partnerships with other planters along the river. And she knew, above all, that he was closely connected to a small circle of men whose shared past reached back across the Gulf of Mexico to a burning plantation in 1804. She did not come to Este. Landry Parish to be owned. She came to close a ledger. 3 months after Celeste's arrival at the Duval plantation, on a humid August night when the air hung so thick it seemed to resist every breath, Sebastien Duval hosted what would later be known as his last dinner party. The invitation list was small and deliberate. 4 men accepted. Armand Leclerc, whose cane fields bordered Duval's property and whose rivalry with him over production was the talk of the parish. Octave Rousseau, a cotton planter whose family claimed to have held land in the region since 1780. Théophile Boudreau, the youngest of the group at 37, who had recently inherited his father's estate and whose name appeared often in letters tied to Sandang, Saint-Domingue, the island that would later be called Haiti. And Philippe Saunier, the parish judge, a man whose signature could make or unmake fortunes, whose influence reached into every courtroom and sheriff's office in the region. Between them, these 5 men, Duval included, owned more than 1,000 enslaved people and tens of thousands of acres. They sat at the center of a web of credit and obligation that defined Este. Landry's economy. The evening began as such evenings always did. In the library, paneled in dark wood imported from Europe, the men drank French cognac, smoked cigars rolled in Cuba or claimed to be, and discussed crop prices, the latest news from Washington, rumors about abolitionists in the North, and the eternal topic of river levels. Dinner was announced at 8. They filed into the formal dining room beneath a chandelier that scattered candlelight across polished silver and crystal glasses. The table groaned with courses. Turtle soup, roasted duck, oysters fixed 3 different ways, spiced vegetables, sugared fruits. The wines, also imported, cost more per bottle than most families earned in month. Servants moved silently between chairs, refilling plates and glasses, clearing away dishes before they cooled. On the surface, it was a triumph of Southern hospitality. Underneath, tension coiled like a snake. Every man at that table knew about Celeste, though none had seen her since her disappearance in Opelousas. They knew her price. They knew Duval had her installed in a cottage rather than in the quarters. They knew he walked with her in the garden. They had heard, in whispers, that she spoke French and could read, that she played the piano in the evenings. They were not just curious. They were obsessed. Duval had been deliberately evasive in his letters when the subject of Celeste arose. He neither promised nor denied that she might appear at the dinner. He understood these men well enough to know that uncertainty was fuel. The more they wondered, the more they wanted. Dessert was being cleared when he finally made his move. He set down his glass, smiled in a way that made Leclerc's jaw tighten, and reached for a small silver bell. Its chime cut lightly through the murmur of conversation. The dining room door opened. Celeste entered wearing a dress of deep indigo blue, so dark it seemed almost black until the candlelight struck it and made the color bloom like a bruise. The dress was modest by evening standards, high at the neck, long in the sleeves, the skirt falling to her ankles. It revealed nothing and suggested everything. The cut of it acknowledged her figure without flaunting it. The indigo was a deliberate choice, a color made from a plant that enslaved people in the Caribbean and the American South had cultivated under backbreaking conditions, staining their hands and their lungs, enriching everyone but themselves. She moved around the table with a kind of contained grace, not deferent, not bold, simply present. Her hair was pinned back, her face unadorned. Her eyes, in the warm light of dozens of candles, had that unsettling golden tint Saunier would later try and fail to describe without sounding superstitious. She did not lower her gaze in the conventional posture of submission. She looked at them, each of them, with an expression that walked a fine line between politeness and challenge. Saunier, who prided himself on rationality, wrote later in a private letter to his brother in New Orleans, "I have seen beautiful women in Paris and New York, women trained from girlhood in every art of charm. But I have never stood in the presence of anyone so entirely conscious of her own power. Despite having no legal rights whatsoever, she held that room as if she were the host and we her guests. It was profoundly disquieting." Duval introduced her simply as Celeste. He did not explain her presence at the table. He did not apologize for it. The men shifted in their chairs, uncertain whether to acknowledge her or pretend she was invisible, as the rules of their society demanded. To ignore her felt impossible. To treat her as a lady would be to shatter a dozen unspoken taboos. She spoke only once. Duval asked her, with a hint of pride, to recite a piece of French poetry. She did so in a low, clear voice, the words falling with the ease of long familiarity. Her accent was impossible to place precisely. There were traces of Caribbean French, perhaps, and something else that did not belong to any salon. When she finished, there was a moment of silence no one had expected. Then, as if struggling to restore the normal order of things, Leclerc made a loud, off-color joke about Parisian actresses, and the men laughed too hard, too quickly. What they remembered most, what they could not shake, was what she did next. Celeste turned slowly and let her gaze rest on each of them in turn, just long enough that each man felt personally seen. There was no coyness in her look, no flirtation in the usual sense. There was only an unnerving suggestion that she knew something about them, something private, something shameful, something they would never have admitted aloud. Then, after a heartbeat that felt too long, she smiled. It was not a submissive smile meant to reassure. It was not the inviting smile of a courtesan. It was almost small, almost private, as if she had just solved a problem in her own mind and was quietly pleased with the result. Then she excused herself with a slight nod and left the room. As she passed, a faint breath of oleander followed her, the same scent that had lingered in the empty boarding-house room months earlier. The party broke up soon after midnight. Each man left with carefully managed composure, offering the usual pleasantries at the door, but their thoughts were elsewhere. They rode home in the dark, the hooves of their horses muffled in the soft dirt of the river road, the smells of cane and marsh thick around them. None of them slept well. Within a week, the letters began to arrive at the Duval plantation. They came on fine paper, sealed with wax-bearing family crests that had survived wars and revolutions. Inside, each one contained an offer, carefully worded but increasingly desperate, to purchase Celeste. Leclerc offered $8,000. Rousseau countered with 10. Boudreau, the youngest and most impulsive, jumped to 12,000 and added, as a kind of flamboyant sweetener, a prized breeding mare valued at another 2,000. But it was Judge Philippe Saunier's letter that revealed the depth of what had taken root in that dining room. "Name your price," he wrote in a hand that grew more uneven with each line. "Whatever you ask, I will pay it if it is in my power. I am not in the habit of being refused. I must have her. I will not know peace until I do." Duval's replies, preserved in Saunier's estate papers, show a man who had succumbed to obsession of his own. He refused every offer, not politely but cruelly. He taunted them, describing Celeste's intelligence, her ability to discuss literature and music, the comfort he found in talking with her late at night, the way she seemed to understand him in ways his late wife never had. He wielded his refusal like a whip, striking at old rivals, enjoying their humiliation. For 6 weeks, this exchange continued. The letters grew shorter, harsher. Old friendships frayed under the strain. Business partnerships cooled. Men who had once trusted one another with co-signed loans and shared risks started to keep their own counsel, to suspect hidden plots. The center of gravity in the parish shifted, subtly at first, then more violently, all because of one woman who said very little and whose true thoughts remained her own. On October 3, 1839, Sebastien Duval was found dead in his study. He was discovered by a servant who had come to bring him his morning coffee and collect the previous night's empty cup. The study door was closed but not locked. Inside, Duval sat slumped over his desk, one cheek pressed against the polished wood. One hand lay open near a sheet of paper, the other was tightly clenched around a scrap of deep blue fabric. His eyes were wide open, fixed on a point above the far wall, as if he had died in the act of staring at something that only he could see. The letter before him was addressed to Armand Leclerc. The ink was still glistening in places, the lines uneven, interrupted. It read, "You must not pursue this further. She is not what you think. I have made a terrible mistake bringing her here. If you value your life and your soul, you will forget you ever saw." The sentence broke off mid-word. A blot of ink marked the place where his hand had stopped. The local doctor, called at once, examined the body with professional detachment. There were no knife wounds, no bullet holes, no bruises on the throat. The heart had simply stopped. Apoplexy, the doctor said. A seizure, perhaps brought on by stress. It was a convenient conclusion, one that required no further questions, no messy investigations into scandalous entanglements. But there were details that did not fit. Servants reported that the night before, they had heard Duval's voice rising in anger and fear from behind the closed study door. At first, they assumed he was arguing with someone, perhaps Celeste, perhaps a business associate who had overstayed his welcome. But when one of them crept closer to listen, they heard only one voice, Duval's, speaking in overlapping bursts of pleading and rage, as if answering another speaker they could not hear. Celeste was nowhere to be found. Her cottage stood empty, the bed made, her few possessions gone. There were no signs of struggle. The only things left behind were a folded piece of indigo cloth on the pillow and the now familiar, cloying scent of oleander hanging in the air. Under normal circumstances, such a death, in such a household, would have been quietly buried along with the body. But these were not normal circumstances. Duval's status, his debts, and his feud with other planters made scandal impossible to fully contain. The parish authorities were forced to respond. Judge Philippe Saunier took charge of the investigation, both as a matter of law and, perhaps, as a matter of personal obsession. He ordered the formation of search parties to hunt for Celeste. Riders scoured the roads. Dogs were brought in from neighboring plantations. Notices were posted as far as Baton Rouge. But Saunier also made a decision he would later regret. He ordered that the search be conducted as quietly as possible. No broadside, no mention in the newspapers, no talk in open court. Officially, the investigation focused on unknown causes in Duval's death. Unofficially, Saunier did not want the woman found by anyone but himself. The hunt for Celeste ceased to be a legal duty and became a competition between four men, Leclerc, Rousseau, Boudreau, and Saunier, each convinced that he could find her first, each telling himself that he alone would not share Duval's fate. Armies of enslaved men were dispatched into swamps. Bounties were raised in private. A man named Caleb Frost, a slave tracker from Mississippi with a reputation for finding runaways others had given up on, was hired by Rousseau at great expense. Boudreau rode for hours every day, his horse lathered, his clothes stained, his eyes growing hollow. They were hunting a woman. What they did not understand was that they were already moving along paths she had traced in her mind years before. Weeks passed. Winter began its slow, unsettling approach, bringing not clean cold but wild swings in temperature. Hot days that felt borrowed from July, followed by nights that killed flowers where they stood. The social atmosphere in the parish grew as unpredictable as the weather. Men snapped at one another in court. Business deals stalled without clear reason. Wives found their husbands distracted, anxious, irritable. The name Celeste was not spoken openly anymore, but it seemed to hover at the edges of every conversation. Then, in early December, she reappeared. A patrol on the river road spotted her first. It was just after sunset, and the sky above the river still held a smear of red. She was walking alone along the dust-packed track, her skirts held just clear of the ground, her step unhurried. When the patrol rode up, hands on their weapons, she did not run. She did not even look surprised. She simply stopped and watched them approach. The man in charge of the patrol, caught between greed and fear, decided she was too valuable to risk sending anywhere but to the man who now held legal authority over the case. They took her not to one of the planters, but to Judge Saunier's plantation. Saunier had her placed in an unused overseer's house, a small but sturdy building with its own fireplace, a bed, a table, and a chair. Guards were posted at the door. They were given explicit instructions. No one was to mistreat her. She was to be guarded, not punished. That evening, Saunier himself visited the cottage. He brought food, a better meal than most of his enslaved servants would ever see, and a bottle of wine. He brought candles and a book of French poetry. What passed between them that night has never been recorded. No one was allowed close enough to hear their words. From a distance, servants saw the soft flicker of candlelight through the window until nearly dawn. They also heard something else, carried on the cold December air. Laughter. A man's laughter, harsh and uncertain. And a woman's, low and knowing, the sound of someone who has already decided how a story will end. In the morning, Saunier sent letters to Leclerc, Rousseau, and Boudreau. The text was brief, almost contemptuously so. The matter we have all been concerned with has been resolved. The property in question is now in my possession and will remain so. I advise you strongly to abandon any further interest in this affair. The replies he received back, kept among his papers, read like documents written from the edge of a cliff. Leclerc's letter was a tangle of rage and supplication. Rousseau's was icy and hinted at legal challenges. Boudreau's letter sprawled over 10 pages, veering between declarations of love for a woman he had seen once and descriptions of dreams that left him shaken, dreams of dark water and a woman's voice calling his name from beneath the surface. For the next 3 weeks, Saunier visited the overseer's cottage every evening. He came at twilight, stayed until late into the night, and emerged increasingly altered. He grew thinner. His normally impeccable clothes became less carefully maintained. He sometimes forgot to wear a cravat, or appeared in court with ink on his cuffs. Dark hollows formed beneath his eyes. His decisions from the bench became erratic, harsh in one case, lenient in another with no clear reason. Lawyers muttered. Other judges exchanged worried glances. His wife, a woman of proud New Orleans lineage, watched all this with mounting horror. After a particularly bitter argument behind closed doors, she packed her things, gathered their 3 children, and left the plantation for her father's home in the city. Servants heard her say as she stepped into the carriage, "If the law cannot restrain my husband, I must pray that God will." Saunier did not follow her. He did not send for her. It is not clear he even noticed she was gone. On the morning of December 27, 1839, as a pale sun struggled through low winter clouds, an enslaved man from Saunier's plantation ran to the main house, shouting that something terrible had happened. The judge's body lay on the bed in the overseer's cottage, not in his own marital chamber. His eyes were wide open, fixed on the ceiling, and his right hand was clenched around a small piece of indigo cloth. There were no signs of struggle. His face bore an expression of such raw terror that even men hardened by years of slave whippings and flood disasters looked away. The physician who examined him, perhaps chastened by the earlier misdiagnosis in Duval's case, took more care this time. He noticed small traces of plant matter under Saunier's fingernails and between his teeth, as if he had been chewing leaves. Samples were eventually compared to known specimens and identified as oleander, a plant whose beauty in southern gardens hides a lethal heart. Even handling it carelessly can be dangerous. Ingesting it can stop the heart. Yet the physician could not say with certainty whether the amount found in Saunier's body was enough to kill or merely to weaken. The official record hedged. Heart failure of uncertain origin, and the investigation, such as it was, ended there. Celeste was gone. Again. The guards at her door swore no one had entered or left the cottage during the night. The windows were barred. The chimney was too narrow for a grown adult. And yet she had vanished. On the pillow lay a carefully folded piece of indigo cloth. The air carried that same faint, deceptive sweetness. 2 men dead within 3 months. 3 men still alive, each bound to the dead by a shared dinner, a shared desire, and, though they did not know it yet, a shared guilt that stretched back 35 years. The parish was about to learn a lesson that some never properly absorbed. Not all hunts are initiated by the hunters. Sometimes the prey has been directing the chase for so long that by the time the men with guns and dogs realize it, they are already walking into the trap she laid. The deaths of Duval and Saunier should have ended everything. They should have made it clear that to pursue Celeste was to invite death. But obsession is not rational, and guilt rarely yields to caution. If anything, the deaths intensified the other men's hunger. There were fewer competitors now. The prize seemed closer. The new judge assigned to the case after Saunier's death was a man from Baton Rouge named Tien Machond. He arrived in St. Landry with no personal history in the parish, no long-standing friendships with the planters, and a reputation for being both methodical and blunt. He read through the existing files, frowned at the vagueness, and began again from the beginning. He tried to take testimonies from servants at both plantations. Their statements were frustratingly contradictory. Some claimed Celeste had moved through the houses like a ghost. Others insisted she had never set foot in the main rooms. Some remembered hearing arguments, others swore the nights had been silent. Machond suspected fear more than confusion. The enslaved people knew very well that saying the wrong thing about the wrong person in front of the wrong white man could be fatal. He ordered a second examination of Saunier's body, this time by a physician from New Orleans who had studied the newer techniques of forensic medicine in Paris. Dr. Henri Laval arrived with instruments and a cool demeanor that did not change even when he began hearing local rumors about the Indigo woman. He conducted a careful autopsy, then asked to see anything that had passed through Saunier's hands before his death. That was how he came upon the traces of oleander, and began quietly rewriting the narrative from apoplexy to poisoning. While Machond followed the medical evidence, Leclerc and Boudreau pursued a different angle. Whether motivated by self-preservation or a belated stirring of conscience, they began investigating Celeste's past. They sent inquiries to contacts in Charleston, Savannah, Richmond. They bribed slave traders and clerks. They obtained access to bills of sale and shipping manifests. Bit by bit, a pattern emerged. Celeste, under one name or another, had been sold 4 times before arriving in Louisiana. Each time, she passed from one household of wealth and cruelty to another. Each time, something unfortunate happened at that property. In Virginia, the man who owned her fell into sudden financial ruin, making an investment so reckless that other planters shook their heads in disbelief, then hanged himself in his tobacco barn. In Savannah, 2 brothers who had bitterly competed to purchase her ended up facing each other in a dawn duel. Both died. Witnesses could not later agree on what had sparked their quarrel. In Charleston, the owner from whose estate Thebault had acquired her died of what the medical note called brain fever, an elegant phrase that hid more than it revealed. Then Leclerc found the detail that changed everything. In an 1825 shipping manifest from Virginia, he discovered a notation regarding a small plantation owned by a botanist, a man who had devoted his land to cultivating medicinal and poisonous plants. The manifest listed several enslaved workers trained in the tending of experimental gardens, among them a girl of 12 identified as Celeste, property of Boudreaux Estate, Sandang origin. The botanist had died, the manifest noted in dry ink, of accidental poisoning 2 years later. His wife, settling the estate, had written in her diary that she could not bear to keep these servants who have learned so much of death plants. She sold them all. This was the missing piece. Somewhere in those years among foxglove and nightshade, castor beans, and oleander, the girl from Sandang had learned more than just how to weed beds and carry water. She had learned how plants could be used to kill without leaving marks. She had learned what leaves could be chewed to cause a fever, what stems could slow a heartbeat, what smoke could silently poison a body over time. She had watched the botanist, watched his experiments, his doses, his mistakes. And when he died, she carried that knowledge with her into every plantation that followed. When Leclerc realized what he had found, his first impulse was not to turn this information over to Michonde, but to warn Rousseau, who by then had embraced his own personal madness. Rousseau had returned from New Orleans convinced that he had found Celeste. He brought home a woman who seemed to match her description, tall, copper-skinned, golden-eyed. But to those who had seen the original woman at Duval's, something was off. Her posture was different. The stillness was gone, replaced by a studied softness. Her eyes lacked that strange patience. She called herself Celeste when he brought her home and installed her not in the slave quarters but in a furnished guest room in the main house. Within days, he had dismissed his middle-aged housekeeper for insubordination after she objected to this arrangement. He bought his new prize jewelry, fine fabrics, perfumes from New Orleans. He stopped appearing regularly in his own fields. He spent hours shut in with her. When Leclerc rode out to warn him that Celeste was dangerous, that she had been tied to death and ruination for years, Rousseau met him on the porch with a rifle. "She chose me," he shouted. "Just as she chose Duval. Just as she chose Sonia. But I will not die as they did, because I understand her. She must be treated as an equal, not as property." The statement would have been laughable if it had not been so grotesque coming from a man who owned more than 300 human beings. In his fevered conviction, he did not see the irony. That night, Rousseau sat down to dinner in his own dining room. The woman he called Celeste insisted on preparing the meal herself as a sign, she said, of gratitude. The kitchen smelled of roasted poultry, fresh herbs, warm bread. They ate by candlelight, just the 2 of them. Servants were dismissed early. In the morning, he was found dead in his bed, eyes open, indigo cloth in his hand. The physician Michonde brought in from New Orleans found unmistakable traces of oleander in Rousseau's stomach and in the dressing of the salad he had eaten the night before. Young oleander leaves, chopped finely, mixed among other bitter greens. Enough to kill a man within hours. The woman who had cooked for him, the false Celeste, had vanished in the night. This time, someone saw her leave. A young enslaved woman named Marie, who worked in the kitchen, told Michonde she had seen the guest walk away from the house just before dawn, carrying a small bag. She did not look like the woman Master brought from the city, Marie said carefully. Her face, her walk, they were different. I think she was disguised when he found her. Now she looks like herself again. It was a small testimony, but it confirmed Michonde's growing suspicion. Celeste knew how to alter not only her manner but her apparent age, her weight, even the way she moved. She understood exactly how much most men did not see when they looked at the women who work for them. After Rousseau's death, Marchand stopped treating the matter as a series of unfortunate coincidences. He issued a public arrest warrant for Celeste. He had her description circulated throughout Louisiana and into neighboring states. He offered a $5,000 reward, more money than most people would ever see, for information leading to her capture. Along with this, he quietly ordered that Boudreaux and Leclerc be placed under protective custody. Leclerc, haunted by what he had learned and by his own presence on that ship in 1804, agreed immediately. He left his plantation and moved into a hotel in Opelousas under guard, taking only a few personal effects and 2 trusted servants. His cane fields, for the first time in decades, were left largely to overseers. Boudreaux refused. He had begun to come apart in ways that frightened even his own relatives. He had lost weight until his clothes hung on him. His hands trembled. Servants heard him muttering to himself in empty rooms, talking to someone who was not there. When Marchand visited his plantation to insist on protective custody, Boudreaux met him on the front porch, hair uncombed, shirt half-buttoned, eyes wild. "You don't understand," Boudreaux said. "None of you understand. She's not coming to kill me. She's coming to free me. I have been waiting for her." When Marchand asked, "Free you from what?" Boudreaux only smiled in a way that made Marchand think of drowning men. "Ask her," he said. "Ask her about the Boudreaux plantation in Sandang. Ask her about the fire in 1804. Ask her about the woman and the child my father had thrown into the sea." That night, Marchand returned to his office and pulled older records, shipping manifests from the Gulf, estate papers from French planters who had fled the Haitian Revolution. That was when he finally saw the whole beginning of the story. In 1804, as revolutionary fires consumed plantations in Saint-Domingue, a French planter named Gaspar Boudreaux fled his estate. Before he boarded the ship that would carry him to Louisiana, he had the hold packed with valuables, plate, jewelry, documents, and a small number of enslaved people he considered most valuable. Among them, one manifest noted in a cramped clerk's hand: Marguerite, age 27, and child, age 5, female. Property of Boudreaux. Somewhere between that island and the Louisiana shore, Marguerite and her child disappeared. Marchand tracked down one of the few surviving relatives from that voyage, an elderly aunt of Thophile's who still lived in a fading house in New Orleans. Her memory was cracked but certain on some points. She remembered the plantation burning. She remembered the smell of smoke on the sea. She remembered Gaspar Boudreaux standing on the deck, his face lit by flames, furious that one of his slaves had tried to run. She remembered the brand burned into a woman's shoulder as punishment. And she remembered what he had done next. He said she would die anyway, the old woman told Marchand, her hands twisting in her lap. From the infection. From the fever. He said the child would be nothing but trouble. So he had them thrown overboard. I heard the child screaming. I heard the mother calling. He said the sharks would do the rest. When we reached Louisiana, he told everyone they died of fever. No one asked questions. No one ever does. If the child had truly been 5 in 1804, she would have been about 35 in 1839, not 26 as the Bose notes claimed. But ages in slave records were notoriously imprecise, especially when it benefited an owner to claim a person was younger or older than they were. If Celeste was that child, she had survived something no one expected anyone to survive. Whether she washed ashore, was picked up by another boat, or helped by people whose names will never be known, she lived. She grew up carrying in her memory the sight of her mother drowning, the hollow of the ship's railing under her small hands, the sound of white men laughing. Gaspar Boudreaux had died in 1831. But he had left behind more than land and money. He had left a line of men who profited from his crimes and a network of friends who had looked away instead of intervening. The men at the Duval dinner, Duval himself, Saunier, Leclerc, Rousseau, and the younger Boudreaux, had all been connected to that original plantation system in Sandang. They had all benefited in one way or another from the wealth it generated, even as it burned. Celeste was not killing at random. She was working through a list. On February 14, 1840, deputies arrived at Theophile Boudreaux's plantation with orders from Judge Marchand to bring him to Opelousas by force if necessary. They found the front door standing open and the house oddly quiet. A faint trail of indigo threads, almost like breadcrumbs, led from the foyer down the hallway to his father's old study. There, At the heavy desk where Gaspar Boudreau had once signed bills of sale and loan agreements, Théophile sat slumped in a chair, pen still in his hand, a finished letter before him. His other hand clutched a piece of indigo cloth. A teacup sat nearby, still holding warm liquid fragrant with crushed oleander leaves. The letter he had written was addressed to Celeste. It has survived, copied in Marchand's careful script. In it, Théophile confessed that he had watched from a ship's rail as a small girl and her mother were thrown into the sea. He confessed that he had seen their faces every night since, heard their screams in his dreams, and known, from the moment he saw Celeste at Duval's dinner table, who she was. "I deserve whatever fate you have chosen for me," he wrote. "I welcome it. I cannot carry this any longer." It was a suicide note written to the person he understood as his executioner. Servants later told Marchand that a woman matching Celeste's description had arrived that afternoon. Boudreau had ordered that she be admitted to the study. They talked for about an hour behind a closed door. No voices were raised. When she left, she carried a small basket. Inside the house, no one dared stop her. Out in the yard, she walked with the same deliberate pace as always. On the desk she left behind, along with the letter and the cooling tea, lay a small book of French poetry. 4 men from that dinner party were now dead. 1 remained. Armand Leclerc, holed up in a hotel room in Arpelousas, surrounded by guards and fear. Leclerc spent 43 days in that room. 43 days of pacing, of checking the locks on the door and the shutters on the windows, of snapping at servants and guards alike. He refused to eat anything he had not watched being prepared from raw ingredients. He insisted on tasting every dish in the kitchen, then having a guard eat from his plate. He began to suspect that even the air might be dangerous. He drank constantly, telling himself that brandy was safer than water. He slept in snatches, waking at every creak of wood or murmur in the hallway. He demanded that the guards outside his door be changed every few hours so that none would have time to be bribed or seduced. His mind, once sharp, became a tangle of elaborate and implausible theories about how Celeste might reach him. "She will come down the chimney," he told Marchand. "She will seep through the walls. She will send poison through the stove smoke." Marchand tried to reason with him. He explained what he had learned about oleander, about salads, and tea and leaves chewed in the dark. He told Leclerc that Celeste was not a demon, not a supernatural force, but a woman with knowledge and a terrifying capacity for patience. Leclerc listened with distracted politeness, then shook his head. "You weren't on that ship," he said. "You didn't see what we did. We brought this with us. Whatever she is now, we made her." On March 28, 1840, a letter arrived at the hotel for Leclerc. It came with the regular mail, business correspondence, newspapers from New Orleans, bills. The envelope was heavy, closed with a seal of indigo wax. Leclerc recognized the handwriting on the front only as unfamiliar, which unsettled him more than if it had belonged to one of his enemies. He opened it with fingers that trembled despite himself. The letter inside was written in an elegant, unhurried hand. "Monsieur Leclerc," it began, "you were there the night my mother died. You stood on the deck of the ship. You were 14, old enough to know right from wrong, and you did nothing. You watched as a woman and a child were thrown into the sea like rotten cargo. You listened to your friend laugh. You believed you would never answer for it. In the years since, you have built a fine reputation. You call yourself a good master because you provide adequate food and shelter. You call yourself a Christian because you allow your slaves to attend services. You have never once questioned the fundamental sin at the core of your life, that you own other human beings and profit from their suffering. I am not a demon. I am not a phantom. I am simply the consequence of your actions, delayed but not denied. I am what happens when men convince themselves that there will never be a reckoning. By the time you read this, I am already in the hotel. I have been here for 3 days. I have passed you in the hallway. I have stood outside your door while you slept. Your guards do not see me because they are not looking for me. They look for a beautiful slave woman, exotic and unmistakable. They do not look at the chambermaid who changes your sheets, who is past 30, who is plain and heavy and invisible to men like you. Tonight, you will drink your evening brandy. Tomorrow morning, they will find you as they found the others. And I will move on, because there are more names on my list than were seated at Duval's table. There are other men who were on that ship, who signed those papers, who profited from that burning plantation. There is no bargain you can strike. No money you can offer. Some debts cannot be paid with coin. You wanted to own me. Instead, you will join the others who tried. The letter was unsigned. Leclerc sent for Michonde at once. The judge came, read the letter twice, and felt sweat prickle under his collar. He ordered an immediate search of the hotel. Every guest was questioned. Every servant, stable boy, cook, and clerk was lined up in the courtyard and examined. Rooms were opened, trunks inspected. The hotel's owner protested, but quietly. No one wanted to be seen as obstructing an investigation into 4 dead planters. They found no exotic beauty matching the description on the arrest warrant. Instead, they found what hotels always held: tired travelers, harried wives, silent enslaved valets, and a handful of overworked staff. Among the staff were 3 chambermaids. 2 were women in their 50s, dark-skinned, scarred by work, known to the owner for years. The 3rd was newer, a woman called Louise Benarois, nearly 40, heavy-set, with pock scars on her face and hands. Her papers, produced on demand, stated she was a free woman of color from Mobile, Alabama. She had references, all written in the same neat hand, praising her as honest and industrious. Her landlord in town confirmed she paid her rent on time. She had been working at the hotel for 3 months. Michonde questioned her. He asked whether she knew Monsieur Leclerc. Of course, she said. She cleaned his room every day. She had heard him pacing at night. She said it with faint concern, like someone commenting on a nervous guest. You have been in his room alone? Michonde asked. Only briefly, sir, she replied. To tend the fire, change the sheets, dust. The guards watch me go in and out. I have no opportunity to do anything wrong. The guards nodded. They had indeed watched her. She had never lingered, never done anything strange. She had carried wood, straightened blankets, lowered shutters against the evening chill. She had always seemed like what she appeared to be, a tired woman earning her wages. Michonde looked at her, really looked, letting his eyes pass beyond the scars and the weight and the age. For a second, as she lifted her gaze to his, he saw something flicker there, something like amusement, something like recognition. The color of her eyes, behind the tired lids, was lighter than he had first thought. Not hazel. Not brown. Almost golden. Arrest her, he said quietly. They took Louise into custody and locked her in a cell at the courthouse. Michonde ordered her searched. No poison, no scraps of indigo cloth, no incriminating letters were found. He had the brandy in Leclerc's room examined. It was clean. He had the water tested, the glasses scoured, the plates checked. Nothing. The firewood in the room had already been burned down to ash. The air had been breathed and gone. That night, reassured by having his supposed would-be killer behind bars, Leclerc allowed himself something he had not in weeks: a full meal and 1 glass of brandy before bed. He slept longer than usual, the brandy smoothing the jagged edges of his fear. In the morning, the guards found him dead. Eyes wide. Face contorted. Indigo cloth clenched in his hand. When Michonde went to question Louise, she sat on the stool in her cell, back straight, hands folded. She did not look like a woman on the brink of hanging. She looked, he thought, more like a woman waiting for a train she knew would arrive on time. How did you kill him? Michonde asked. I did not kill anyone, sir, she answered. I have been here, under your watch. You wrote that letter. I do not know what letter you mean. He slammed his hand against the bars, but she did not flinch. Then how do you explain this? He demanded. The cloth. The timing. The letter that knew details only she could know. You are asking the wrong question, Judge, she said softly. You are asking who killed Monsieur Leclerc. The question is when. He frowned. Explain. For 43 days, she said, I tended his fire. Every evening, I brought wood. Sometimes the logs came from the hotel yard. Sometimes, perhaps, from another source. Oleander is such a pretty tree. It burns quite well when dried. The smoke carries its bitterness invisibly. A little poison each night, breathed in and forgotten. You cannot prove what the smoke did once it left the flame. By the time you lock me in here, whatever was going to happen to him was already inside him. You are confessing to murder, he said. I am describing a possibility. Smoke leaves no fingerprints, Judge. Ash tells no tales. Her trial, when it came, lasted 3 days. The prosecution brought everything it had. The pattern of deaths, the letter to Leclerc, the old ship manifest, Marie's testimony, the doctor's findings. The defense pointed to the lack of physical evidence. No one had seen her put poison in food. No one had seen her write the letter. There was no proof that the wood had contained oleander, no logs left to test. The jury saw a scarred woman, past the age of conventional beauty, and could not quite believe she could have orchestrated what they heard described. They were men who relied on the law to protect their property and their pride. To acknowledge her guilt fully would have meant acknowledging their vulnerability. They acquitted her. Louise Benora walked out of the courthouse a free woman. By nightfall, she had vanished from Opelousas. No one could say whether she left by riverboat, on foot, or in the back of a wagon. Michonne watched the courthouse door long after she was gone, feeling an odd, reluctant respect growing alongside his frustration. He had come closer than anyone to catching her. It was not enough. In the years that followed, he devoted much of his private time to tracing her history, not as a judge, but as a man who could not let go of a story. He traveled to Charleston, Savannah, Richmond. He dug through old ledgers in dusty courthouse basements. He spoke to aging traders who had long ago retired from the trade in human beings and were now trying to reinvent themselves as respectable merchants. He found patterns in margins and footnotes. He found records of sudden deaths among men who had been present on that ship in 1804. A banker in New Orleans whose heart failed inexplicably at 49. A factor in Charleston who fell from a balcony after receiving a letter no one ever found. A retired planter in Virginia whose servants found him dead in his chair, eyes wide, holding a scrap of blue cloth. No official record linked these cases. No doctor had written poison on any certificate. But Michonne began to recognize a signature. Indigo, oleander, and silence. By the time he finished his private report sometime in the 1850s, he had identified at least 17 men whose deaths, financial ruin, or both could be traced, indirectly, to Celeste. There may have been more. He never submitted that report to any court. He kept it in a locked drawer in his desk. On his deathbed years later, as the world he had known crumbled in the fires of civil war and emancipation, he showed that locked drawer to his grandson. Inside lay 3 things: a copy of Theophile Boudreau's letter, a strip of faded indigo cloth, and a final letter, postmarked from Boston in 1865. Judge Michonne, that last letter began, written in the same elegant hand that had once spelled out Leclerc's fate. You came closer than anyone to stopping me. You understood what I was doing and why. I have followed your career when I could, in newspaper clippings and in the stories people told about you. I see that you have argued for reforms, that you have spoken against the worst excesses of the system that made you powerful. Perhaps our encounter changed something in you. The war is over now. The laws that once declared me property are breaking. Men are dying on battlefields for reasons they only half understand. The world that was built on my mother's blood and the blood of so many others is collapsing. My work is finished. The men who stood on that deck and watched her drown are all dead. The ones who profited most from that burning plantation have followed them. The list I carried in my memory for 35 years is complete. I was never a demon. I was a woman who refused to forget. Every night, I remembered my mother's face in the water. Every day, I carried that memory into the homes of the men who believed themselves untouchable. Patience and knowledge were the only weapons allowed to me, and I used them as carefully as any soldier uses a rifle. I do not ask for your forgiveness. I do not expect your approval. But I hope you understand this. When law protects only the powerful and denies justice to the powerless, the law does not erase the need for justice. It merely delays it and changes its shape. The indigo cloth came from the dress my mother wore the night they branded her for trying to escape. I kept what I could salvage when the flames died down. Each time I left a piece in a dead man's hand, I was placing her back at the center of the story, refusing the erasure that men like them believed inevitable. If you judge me, remember that there was never a courtroom where my mother's killers could be tried. There was only the sea, and time, and me. The letter was unsigned, but Michonne never doubted its author. After his death, his grandson inherited the locked drawer and its contents. The report was never made public. The cloth disappeared. The letters, copied and recopied by curious archivists, then misplaced, then found, fed whispers among historians who did not know what to do with a story that was at once too neat and too jagged to fit any official narrative. The plantations once owned by Duval, Saunier, Leclerc, Rousseau, and Boudreau did not survive the war. Their lands were broken up, sold, lost to creditors, swallowed by newer enterprises. Their family names, once spoken with deference along the river, faded from the parish rolls. None of their direct lines remain in that region. In a way, they received what they had tried to give to others. Erasure. The story of Celeste, the most desired enslaved woman in Louisiana, is not a ghost story, though it moves through history like one. There are no rattling chains, no apparitions and mirrors. There is only a girl thrown into the sea, a woman who surfaced where she was not supposed to, a lifetime of studying the weaknesses of men who believe themselves invincible, and a long, cold patience that turned their desires into instruments of their own destruction. It is the story of the terrible memory of the oppressed, of the quiet ways in which systems of injustice create their own destroyers. It is a reminder that when you build a society on the assumption that some people can be used and discarded without consequence, you are writing a debt into history's ledger. You may not live to see it paid, but someone will.